Good evening, traveler. Have you ever wondered if the Vikings were really as wild and brutal as the movies make them seem? But first, I'm curious. Where are you listening from tonight? What time is it where you are? Are you tucked safely in bed, or perhaps sitting by a window as the world grows quiet around you? Leave a comment below and let me know when and where you're joining me for this journey into the past. I love hearing from fellow travelers through time. We're shown warriors with braided beards and horned helmets, storming beaches with axes raised high, roaring through smoke and flame. It's a striking image, loud, dramatic, and endlessly repeated in pop culture. But it's also largely fiction. Those myths, spun by storytellers and screenwriters, have overshadowed something quieter, slower, and perhaps more human: the real lives of the Norse people. Tonight, we leave behind the clamor of conquest and step into a softer, steadier world. The screen goes dark. You settle in. And as your breathing slows, we drift gently through time, over windswept seas, frost-laced forests, and narrow inlets, to reach the coasts of Scandinavia more than 1,000 years ago. But not to a battlefield, to a home. Because long before they were legends, Vikings were people: farmers, herders, fishers, weavers, and parents. Most of them never lifted a sword. They tended sheep, carved wood, gathered herbs, and lived their entire lives within a few miles of where they were born. Their daily world was not forged in battle, but in routine. It was a life of rhythm, of chores, of deep ties to land, family, and story. The word Viking itself didn't mean what we now think. It wasn't an identity. It was a verb. To go a Viking was to go voyaging or raiding. Only a small portion of Norse men did so, and not always for glory. Many left because of hardship, overcrowding, or hunger. Those who stayed behind, the vast majority, kept the society running, building, baking, birthing, and burying. They lived close to the earth and close to each other. Villages were small, clusters of low wooden buildings with steep roofs of thatch or sod, built to withstand harsh winters and heavy snow. The central structure in many homes was the longhouse, one long room where everything happened. It was kitchen, bedroom, workshop, and shelter. Inside, a central hearth burned day and night, its smoke curling slowly toward a smoke hole in the roof. This fire was the heart of the home, used for warmth, cooking, light, and even spiritual rituals. The air inside was thick with scents: peat smoke, salted fish, wool, and the earthy tang of packed dirt floors. Benches lined the walls, often covered in sheepskin. Tools hung neatly on pegs. Above, dried herbs dangled from the rafters: thyme, yarrow, and angelica, used in both medicine and food. You can almost hear the low crackle of the fire, the clink of a pot lid being shifted, the occasional muffled laughter or lullaby. Outside, the world moved at a different pace. Life was shaped by the seasons. In summer, people fished the fjords, mended boats, sheared sheep, and repaired roofs. In autumn, they gathered berries, smoked meats, and stored grain. Winter was for mending nets, telling stories, and surviving the cold. And spring, if it came early, meant muddy paths, swelling rivers, and fresh lambs on unsteady legs. There was no clock, no rush, no frantic pace. Tasks unfolded one at a time: spinning thread, shaping tools, kneading bread. Children learned by watching. Old stories were shared again and again. And behind it all was the ever-present awareness of nature's power, of snow that could trap you indoors for weeks, or seas that might never return your kin. Spiritual life was just as grounded. Norse gods were not remote and unknowable. They were part of the landscape. Thor protected farmers. Freya guarded fertility and peace. Offerings were left on flat stones, near trees or rivers. The sacred was not separate from the daily. It flowed through it. A carved charm around the neck, a whispered blessing over the hearth, a gesture made without thinking. And always the family stood at the center. Kinship was more than blood. It was identity, duty, protection. You were known by your lineage, your deeds, and your honor. Reputation was currency, and hospitality was law. To feed a stranger was to feed the gods themselves. So tonight, as you drift gently deeper into rest, we begin this journey not with the clashing of swords, but with the soft rustle of wool, the hush of snow against a shutter, the creak of timber beams under thatch. This is the beginning of the real Viking world, not the world of fire and steel, but of smoke, silence, and steady hands. And in that quiet, there is something deeply peaceful, something worth remembering. The stillness of a Viking village was never truly silent. It was filled with small, steady sounds, footsteps crunching over frost-covered earth, the distant bleating of sheep, the creak of wooden tools in motion. Life here unfolded not in dramatic clashes, but in slow, repeated tasks shaped by necessity, patience, and care. At the break of dawn, before the sun cleared the tree line, the longhouse would begin to stir. Someone would stoke the hearth's embers, coaxing the glow back into flame. A pot of broth might be hung to warm, and flatbread dough pressed by hand, shaped from yesterday's grain. Children rose slowly, wrapped in cloaks or fur-lined tunics. No bells rang, no schedules pressed, only the rhythm of daylight and chores to be done before frost returned. Work was divided, but not always by strict gender roles. Women held powerful positions in the household and sometimes beyond. A Viking woman might manage a farm, oversee stores for a clan, or act as healer, midwife, or merchant. Many wore keys at their waist, a symbol of authority over food, goods, and the rhythms of home. Men tended animals, built boats, or hunted. But women's work extended far beyond weaving and cooking. They preserved knowledge, administered estates, and participated in legal matters. Children learned early. There were no schools, but learning was constant. A boy might follow his father to the fields, learning how to guide an ox or mend a fence. A girl might help her mother stir pots, weave wool, or sort herbs. Skills passed not through lectures, but through repetition and quiet demonstration. In the evenings, stories were told, tales that taught values, courage, loyalty, patience, and pride in one's name. Clothing was simple, warm, and handmade. Wool was spun and woven at home, dyed with woad or madder for soft blues and reds. Tunics, trousers, cloaks pinned with brooches, and fur-lined shoes were the norm. Nothing was wasted. Cloth scraps became patches. Bones were carved into tools. Thread came from flax or sinew. Hands were always working, even in conversation. Outside, the village hummed with motion. Someone repaired nets. Another chipped ice from the well. A group gathered kindling. A hunter checked traps along a ridge. A fisher mended line on the shore. Wood was chopped, fences checked, tools sharpened. There was always something to tend. If a task was neglected, it could mean hunger or exposure. Yet despite the constant labor, the tone wasn't always grim. Neighbors traded jokes. Children chased each other across the frozen paths. Songs were hummed over spinning wheels. Meals were shared. And when day's work ended, families gathered at the hearth, wrapped in warmth and light. This was the true heart of Viking life, not in raids or gold, but in quiet togetherness by firelight. Their stories rarely focused on daily life. They told of gods and giants, sea serpents and heroes. They spoke of the 9 worlds, the roots of Yggdrasil, Odin wandering in disguise, and Thor riding across the sky. These weren't just entertainment. They were explanations for thunder, storm, and fate. They made sense of the world's chaos and beauty. Thunder was Thor's hammer striking. A chill wind might be a wandering spirit, but belief wasn't dramatic. It was part of the everyday. A carved charm by the door, a small offering near a tree, a rune traced in wood, sacred groves tucked between hills where people left food or silver with reverent whispers. There were no churches, only quiet acts of devotion. Even death was not an end, but a crossing, perhaps to Valhalla or to the colder realm of hell. What mattered was how one lived, with courage, with steadiness, with honor to family and gods. Viking joy wasn't constant, but it was real. When boats returned safely or harvests were good, the village feasted. Ale was passed, songs were raised, and drums echoed into the trees. Tales flowed freely, old and new. Laughter mixed with flickering firelight. These bright moments broke up the long, cold seasons and reminded people of what they endured for. So as we look closer, the legends begin to fall away. Beneath the stories of conquest and rage lies a quieter truth, a people of discipline, kinship, and care. Life was hard, yes, but it was not cruel. It was shaped by necessity, supported by ritual, softened by music and warmth. They endured because they helped each other endure. And now, as the hearth fades and stars gather over dark roofs, we too slow down. The village rests, the voices quiet, the fire settles to embers. In this ancient stillness, we find something gentle, a rhythm of life, remembered in silence. Now let us step outside the village and follow the worn paths that wind toward the sea. The coast, so often painted as a backdrop for raids and departure, was more than a launching point for violence. It was a place of harvest, of trade, and of watchful waiting. The long, sloping beaches, strewn with kelp and driftwood, smelled of salt and tar. Children would gather shells here, or watch seabirds circle overhead, while adults checked the tide and read the wind. The Viking Sea wasn't just a field for conquest, it was a provider. Fish were vital to survival. Nets of woven flax were cast from shallow boats or the shore, catching herring, cod, or salmon during seasonal runs. Some men waded into the icy water to set traps or bait lines, while others rowed toward deeper currents. Their boats weren't always the sleek, dragon-headed longships of legend. Many were small, square-sailed workboats with flat bottoms and patched planks, built more for utility than show. These quiet maritime labors made coastal families stronger than myth suggests. Fish were cleaned and dried on racks, smoked in low huts, or salted and packed in barrels for winter. Seaweed was gathered to fertilize fields, shellfish collected by hand, seabirds hunted for eggs, meat, or down. A good day at sea was a gift, a buffer against famine. A bad day could mean lost nets, frozen limbs, or worse. But the sea brought more than food. It brought visitors, traders, messengers. The horizon itself held promise. On calmer days, sails might appear, neighbors returning perhaps, or someone from a distant fjord. When a longboat arrived, the village came alive with excitement. Children ran to the shore. Women prepared extra food. Men asked eager questions about distant weather, new prices, and strange lands. Trade was not a footnote of Viking life. It was its lifeblood. From the North Sea to the rivers of Rus, the Norse were merchants as much as warriors. A single boat might carry fur, amber, soapstone, or carved combs, then return with silks from Byzantium, beads from the east, or blades forged far away. Coins passed from hand to hand, Frankish, Arabic, or minted centuries earlier. These weren't pirates hoarding gold. They were traders filling gaps in their world's puzzle, bringing back what their village could not make. And with trade came talk. News of kings and wars, eclipses and strange beasts. Stories filtered through languages, some half true, some pure invention. The Norse were great listeners, even greater retellers. A rumor from the east could become a saga in the making, repeated by the hearth with new flourishes each time. Not all journeys ended in homecoming. The sea took its toll. Sometimes a boat vanished. Sometimes only a survivor returned. Death at sea was feared, but not unexpected. Wives and mothers would watch the horizon for weeks. If a boat failed to return, a cairn might be raised, or an offering left at the shore where surf whispered like breath. The sea demanded reverence. Still, for all its danger, it was trusted. Children were taught to swim early, to read the tide, to respect the fog. Navigation wasn't done with compasses, but with clouds, waves, birds, and memory. The sun's arc, the color of water, the scent of salt and wind. These were tools passed down through generations. The Vikings were not reckless, they were precise, tuned to the language of the coast. And above all else, their boats were sacred. Built from oak and fastened with iron rivets, each ship was born from months of labor. Keels carved with care, hulls curved like ribs. Every line mattered. These were not disposable machines, but companions, given names and blessings. Runes might be carved into the bow. Incantations whispered before launch. A well-built ship was the pride of its crew, a floating home, protector, and path. At sea, time passed differently. The days were long, but marked not by hours, only by sun and sail. Silence was common, each crewman busy with thoughts or scanning the sea's shifting face. A gull's cry, a splash, the creak of rope. These were the voices of travel. Sometimes songs were sung, low rhythmic chants to keep Rowan steady. But often there was only wind, wood, and water. Back on shore, the rest of the village watched the sea in its moods. A red dawn meant storms, a sudden fog, danger. The coastline wasn't a distant setting, it was part of their being. It taught them patience, loss, skill, and reward. It gave them fish, friends, and the means to dream of other lands. And so, in these quiet labors and careful crossings, another myth unravels. The Vikings weren't just destroyers. They were stewards of a world both harsh and beautiful. They listened to the tide, bartered with strangers, and whispered thanks to the sea. Let us leave the shoreline now and return to the village. Not to the forge or the fields, but to the heart of something more intimate, mealtime and the rhythms of the hearth. If Viking raiding and sailing made the myths, it was the quiet act of cooking that made the days. At the center of most homes stood the fire pit, dug into the packed earthen floor, its smoke curling upward through a hole in the roof. Around it gathered the household, not only for warmth and light, but for nourishment, comfort, and routine. The fire was constant, a low and steady presence that rarely went out. It was fed carefully, kept alive like a member of the family. Food was seasonal, local, and practical. What could be grown, preserved, or hunted made its way into the pot. Barley was common. boiled into porridge, fermented into beer, or baked into flatbreads. The bread wasn't fluffy or sweet, but dense, dark, and filling. Grains were ground by hand with heavy quernstones, often by women and children, their arms aching in the quiet repetition. Still, it was an act of sustenance and of care. Meat was less common than one might think. A family might slaughter a pig or a goat only during a feast or at the onset of winter. More often, they relied on what could be caught: fish from the coast, birds from the woods, or rabbits snared in quiet traps. Wild herbs and onions grew in patches near the village. Nettles, too, were boiled down, losing their sting and offering a subtle, iron-rich broth. Vegetables were sparse but valued. Cabbage, leeks, turnips, and peas all found their way into thick stews. These simmered in iron pots hung over the fire, flavoured with salt if it was available, or simply with patience. Sometimes bones were added, for taste, for strength, or because that was all that remained. The longer the pot boiled, the richer the result. Dairy played a quiet role. Cows were not always kept for meat, but for their milk, turned into butter, cheese, or buttermilk. These weren't luxuries, but essentials. A smear of soft cheese on barley bread or a sip of warm milk might be the only indulgence of a cold evening. Butter was churned by hand, the rhythm slow and meditative. It was stored in cool pits or clay jars, away from the sun and damp. Water was not always trusted. Streams could be tainted, wells could dry. So ale, mild and often cloudy, was a safer drink for all ages. Not intoxicating in the way modern drinkers might expect, but nourishing and easier on the stomach. Honeyed mead was rarer, saved for special days, or made in small batches from hives carefully tended at the edge of the woods. In the evenings, families gathered close. The stew pot would be lifted, the bowls shared. Wooden spoons, rough and worn, passed from hand to hand. There were no formal dining tables in most homes. People sat on benches or furs, the glow of the fire flickering across faces weathered by sun and labour. Children dozed against mothers' shoulders, and elders spoke softly of the day's tasks, of dreams, or of old stories told again with new warmth. Table manners were simple but meaningful. Sharing was not only expected, it was survival. A guest was offered food before questions. A traveller, even a stranger, might be given bread and ale without suspicion. Hospitality was sacred. In a world where weather could trap a man in snow or darkness fall fast over the fjords, kindness could mean life or death. Special meals were rare, but deeply meaningful. During the winter solstice or a successful harvest, more elaborate feasts might take place. These were not daily affairs, but carefully prepared moments of joy. Extra meat might be roasted, honey reserved for sweetened cakes, or mead poured more freely. Stories were told longer, and laughter lasted later. But even then, the rhythm returned the next day. The pot was refilled. The bread was baked. The fire tended, as always. The quiet dignity of Viking cooking, its reliance on what the earth gave, its rhythm and restraint, paints a very different image from modern assumptions. This was not a culture of gluttony or excess. It was one of survival, gratitude, and resourcefulness. The idea of a horn-helmeted warrior tearing into a feast of meat and mead is a fiction. The truth is gentler. What nourished the Vikings most was not volume, but effort. Not excess, but care. A spoonful of stew after a cold day in the field. A crust of bread shared without question. A fire that never died, even when the wind howled outside. And so their lives were sustained, not by mythic conquest or stolen treasure, but by the warmth of a bowl, the smell of smoke and grain, and the quiet strength of daily ritual. After the stew was eaten and the fire stoked for the night, other small rituals unfolded in the Viking home, rituals not of battle or legend, but of grooming, clothing, and the quiet preservation of dignity. For though films often portray Vikings as grimy or wild, the truth was often quite the opposite. Cleanliness mattered. In fact, so much so that Christian monks across the sea occasionally wrote with dismay about how often Vikings bathed, combed their hair, and even changed their clothes. It was difficult to maintain cleanliness in the long winters and smoky rooms, but effort was made. Saturday was often bath day, what the Old Norse called laugardaga, literally washing day, which still echoes faintly in some Scandinavian languages today. Water was drawn from wells or streams and warmed over the hearth in large iron or clay pots. Steam would gather on the low ceiling beams as family members took turns scrubbing away the week's work. Ash from the fire was sometimes mixed with animal fat to create a rudimentary soap. It smelled earthy and was rough on the skin, but it did the job. Hair was washed, dried near the fire, and carefully combed. Combs, made of bone or wood, are among the most common personal items found in Viking archaeological sites. They were often ornately carved, stored in little leather pouches, and treasured. A man or woman without a comb felt unfinished, incomplete. Men often kept their beards neat, trimming them with iron shears. These shears resembled large tweezers and were usually kept close at hand. Moustaches were shaped, hairlines trimmed. Women tied back their hair in braids or buns, often using decorative pins. Lice combs were also common, fine-toothed and efficient, showing how much attention was paid to comfort and hygiene in a world where illness spread easily. Clothing, too, was more elegant and practical than the ragged furs and leather seen in film. Wool was the most common material, spun by hand and dyed with natural colors. Plant roots, bark, moss, or lichen. Blue and green were favored when the right dyes were available, though most garments faded over time to earthy tones of brown or gray. Linen, lighter and cooler, was used for underclothes when possible. Men wore long tunics, belted at the waist, over trousers or leggings. Women dressed in long gowns with overdresses fastened at the shoulders by brooches. These brooches were not just functional. They were expressive, often etched with symbols or animal motifs, and passed down through families. Woolen cloaks, secured with pins or ties, were worn in colder months, sometimes lined with fur from rabbits or foxes. Shoes were handmade, stitched from leather and shaped to the foot. They wore out quickly and needed frequent repair. In the evenings, it was common for someone to sit near the hearth and quietly mend shoes or reattach a worn strap. Children's garments were smaller versions of adults, sometimes patched together from older clothes, but made with the same care. Jewelry was modest but present. A simple ring, a bracelet of twisted bronze, or a pendant hung on a leather cord might be worn daily. Amulets shaped like Thor's hammer, called Mjolnir, were common, a blend of spiritual meaning and personal identity. These weren't symbols of aggression, but of protection, strength, and the old stories whispered by the fire. Even makeup had its place. Traces of coal, used around the eyes, have been found on Viking burial remains, particularly among both men and women. It served not only as decoration, but helped reduce glare from snow and sea. Its use was practical, aesthetic, and sometimes ritual. This attention to appearance was not vanity. It was pride and order and comfort in a world where many things were beyond one's control. A combed beard or a mended cloak was a quiet assertion of dignity. In long winters when the sun barely rose, in winds that howled through the cracks of wooden walls, it mattered to feel clean. It mattered to dress with care, even if there was no one to see. The image of a Viking warrior covered in dirt and blood, snarling beneath a horned helmet, has little in common with the lived experience of most. Real Viking life was a rhythm of small acts: washing hands, brushing hair, adjusting a cloak, threading a needle by firelight. There was a softness to it, often forgotten. And in those silent gestures, in the way a child was dressed for bed, or the way a woman traced embroidery into her hem, there lived a gentleness, not of weakness, but of endurance. A belief that even in a hard world, beauty and care still had a place. That neatness, like firelight, helped hold the darkness back. Step now through the threshold of the Viking home, the longhouse. From the outside it was humble and weathered, its turf walls blending into the earth like part of the landscape. The roof was steep and heavy, covered in sod or thatch, built not for elegance but survival. Smoke curled lazily from the smoke hole, signaling life within, a thin line against the cold grey sky. The doorway was low, requiring a stoop to enter, a simple gesture of humility, or perhaps practicality against the wind. Inside, the world softened into warmth and shadow. The scent of wood smoke lingered everywhere, mingled with wool, earth, dried herbs, and the faint musk of damp straw. In the center lay the hearth, glowing quietly. Its light was gold and restless, throwing shapes across rough-hewn beams and fur-draped benches. This was the heart of everything. The longhouse was more than shelter. It was a universe in miniature, a container for life, labor, and memory. Its walls, lined with woven panels or planks, shut out the screaming winter. Its roof bore the weight of snow. Inside, the family slept, ate, crafted, and planned for tomorrow. Animals sometimes shared this space. Sheep or goats penned near the far end, their breath steaming in the cold morning. They gave warmth as much as they required care. Beds were simple wooden frames or low platforms, layered with straw and covered in blankets of wool or fur. Privacy, as we know it today, was scarce. Curtains might hang between spaces, but voices and movements were always near. Families lived close, their lives stitched together by necessity. In that closeness grew both friction and profound trust, a shared endurance that bound generations not only in blood, but in breath and firelight. Light was scarce. A few small windows, sometimes sealed with thin animal bladder, let in pale glows during the short days. At night, the fire ruled. Oil lamps of stone or clay burned fish oil or animal fat, casting dim halos in the dark. Their flames flickered against carvings in the beams, marks perhaps made for beauty or for blessings whispered in old tongues, half-remembered prayers to keep illness or misfortune at bay. Around the hearth, benches doubled as seating and storage. Chests filled with clothing, tools, and keepsakes lined the walls. These were often among a family's most precious possessions, not because of what they held, but because they held stability. A chest carved with care might outlast its maker, pass down like a quiet voice through time, weathering loss and fire and frost. The air inside was never truly fresh. It carried smoke, damp wool, the faint tang of hides, and the sweetness of stored grain. Herbs hung from rafters in neat bundles, their scents mixing with the musk of earth. In winter, when storms screamed and ice locked the fjords, this single room became a world entire. Here, people spun wool, carved wood, told stories, and endured the long hush between seasons. Sound within a longhouse had its own texture: the crackle of logs, the slow rasp of a whetstone on iron, the murmur of voices bending around the firelight. Sometimes the high laugh of a child broke through the hush, like birdsong in a winter grove. These moments, small yet bright, were threads of resilience woven into long nights, echoing softly from rafter to floor. Longhouses varied in size, but most were modest, built with what the land gave: timber from nearby forests, stone for the foundation, turf for insulation. Every element served purpose. The walls leaned slightly inward, giving the structure strength against storms. The roof curved low to keep heat from fleeing into the dark sky. Craftsmanship was not about ornament, but endurance and knowledge passed down in silence from one pair of hands to the next. Yet, even here, beauty found its way. Carvings crept along the beams, spirals, beasts, interlaced knots. Patterns stitched into blankets spoke of hands that wanted more than survival. These quiet embellishments tell us something essential: that even in a life ruled by hardship, the human desire to shape, to mark, to create never vanished. The longhouse was plain, but it was not without grace. When night thickened and frost pressed against the walls, the door was barred, the lamps dimmed, and the household sank into its layered beds. Breathing softened, the fire's glow fell low, and the world outside vanished beneath snow and silence. Inside, warmth lingered, thin but enough, and in that fragile pocket of light, life persisted, steady as the pulse of embers in the dark. Clothing in the Viking world was not simply about covering the body. It was insulation, identity, and craftsmanship, layers stitched into life by calloused hands and passed across seasons and generations. A Viking's garments began with wool, spun from their own sheep, dyed with roots and lichen, woven on upright looms with patience and care. Every thread told of effort, time, and intimate knowledge of the land. Men wore tunics, often knee-length, belted at the waist, with trousers or leggings beneath. Women wore long dresses, typically layered, an underdress of linen, if available, topped by a heavier woolen apron dress. This apron was often held up by two brooches at the shoulders, sometimes oval-shaped, sometimes more intricate. Between them might hang beads or keys, tokens of status, tools, or keepsakes. These arrangements spoke silently of the woman's role in the household, her skills, or her lineage, and were often passed from mother to daughter. Cloaks were essential in cold climates, fastened with pins or brooches and thrown over one shoulder. Shoes were simple, made of stitched leather, soft and worn quickly, often needing repair. Mittens, hoods, and socks were treasures in the harshest months, sometimes knit, sometimes felted, and passed down like warm whispers through a family line. In regions where winters were brutal, layers were everything, a dance between warmth and weight. Dyes brought gentle colour to the fabric: ochre yellows, soft madder reds, pale blues from woad. There was no screaming brightness, only earthy hues, gentle and subdued, echoing the world around them. Patterns were rare, but stripes or borders might hint at personality or pride. Clothing wasn't about fashion, but familiarity and belonging. A well-kept tunic might be mended many times, its patches becoming part of the story, not a flaw, but a quiet badge of endurance. Children wore simpler versions of adult clothes, smaller and made to last only a season or two before being passed to younger siblings. Growing meant constant adaptation. Mothers sewed by firelight, repurposing old garments, hemming and patching, always aware of the coming winter and the need to stay ahead of wear. The rhythm of the needle mirrored the rhythm of survival. And then there were the quiet acts of grooming and adornment, not the rough, unwashed barbarism of modern depictions, but care, pride, and routine. Combs carved from bone or antler were common, carried in pouches or hung from belts. Vikings combed their hair daily, men and women both, untangling the day's labor and smoothing their appearance with rhythmic familiarity. Hair was often long, tied back or braided, beards were trimmed, shaped. Some accounts speak of soap made from animal fat and ash, used to clean both skin and clothing. Baths, though not daily, were important. Saturday, Logadagur, or bathing day, was a common weekly ritual, often shared communally in hot springs or heated tubs when possible. Cleanliness was not a luxury, but part of order, a weekly reset woven into the calendar. Jewelry was more than decoration. It acted as currency, as protection, as a statement of ties. Rings, armbands, pendants, all often silver, sometimes bronze or glass, were worn by both sexes. Norse knotwork, animal forms, runes. These motifs were carved into even the smallest pieces. A brooch might hold a cloak, but it might also tell of a marriage, a battle, or a homeland far away. Even in hard times, a single necklace bead could be treasured. Made of amber, glass, or imported stones, beads were tokens of memory. Some were traded from distant lands, carrying with them stories older than the longhouse roof. A child might finger a bead that once belonged to their grandmother. In this way, memory passed not only through speech, but through touch, tiny, glinting fragments of history and love. Clothing and grooming were quiet declarations. I belong, I endure, I am part of this place. The modern image of the filthy, ragged Viking does them a disservice. Their lives demanded too much of them to ignore care. A torn cloak could mean sickness. A tangled beard could harbor lice. A broken shoe could make travel impossible. Attention to the body and the fabric around it was not vanity, it was survival. And even survival had room for grace. A braid tucked just so. A pendant shaped like Thor's hammer. A belt dyed the color of berry skins. These choices may seem small, but they point to something deeply human. The desire to make meaning, even in the coldest months and the hardest work. The Viking world was not colorless, nor shapeless, nor wild. It was deliberate, layered, and worn with quiet pride. Tools shaped the Viking world just as surely as sails or swords. Far from the battlefield, a quieter arsenal lived in every home and farmstead. Objects of wood, bone, and iron, each suited to its task, each worn smooth by years of use. These tools were not extravagant, but they were reliable. And in a world that demanded constant labor, reliability was sacred. The axe, perhaps the most iconic Viking tool, was not just a weapon. In fact, most axes never tasted blood. They chopped firewood, carved beams, split planks for boats, and helped raise walls. There were many kinds: broad axes for felling trees, hand axes for splitting kindling, smaller carving axes for finer work. They were hung on belts, leaned against door frames, passed from father to son. The edge was carefully maintained, honed with stones kept close, and oiled to prevent rust. In this, the axe was a companion, not an accessory, an extension of the hand that worked. Hammers and adzes, augers and chisels, these were the vocabulary of construction. Longhouses didn't raise themselves, and boats certainly didn't float without precise shaping. Timber was not abundant in all parts of Scandinavia, so wood had to be chosen carefully and used efficiently. Shipbuilders and carpenters knew the grain of a plank like a shepherd knew his flock. They didn't waste what couldn't be replaced. Inside the home, women worked with looms, spindles, and combs. The loom stood tall like a second doorway, threads stretched like strings of possibility. Spinning wool into yarn was a daily rhythm, performed while walking, talking, or watching the hearth. Wool was cleaned, carded, spun, and dyed in slow stages that followed the calendar. A warm tunic might represent weeks of work. There were no shortcuts, only craft. Knives were ever present, tucked into belts, laid beside breadboards, used in meals and in tasks from skinning fish to shaping dowels. A good knife was indispensable, and children often received their own by the time they were old enough to help. Scissors, too, were forged and valued. Their curved iron blades clipped thread, trimmed cloth, and sometimes sheared fleece. Even the humblest tools had stories. A spinning spindle could be a wedding gift. A worn bone needle might have been carved during a winter storm, then carried for decades. In fishing villages, nets were mended by hand with bone needles. Hooks were shaped from iron or antler. Small boats were built with care, their ribs shaped to glide through cold water with efficiency. Nets were checked, cleaned, and stretched. Time-consuming, fiddly work, often done in the lull between tides, but food depended on it. Farming, too, had its tools. Plows for turning earth, hoes for weeding, scythes for harvest. In places where the land was stubborn, men and women worked side by side to coax it into production. Grain had to be cut at the right moment, threshed, winnowed, and stored. Sacks were stitched from linen or wool, stacked in dry spaces. Nothing could be wasted. Every seed, every root mattered. A dull blade delayed the harvest, and a cracked pot might spoil the stores. Even the kitchen held its own toolkit: wooden spoons and ladles, pottery bowls and iron cauldrons, baking stones and spit rods. Cauldrons hung over the hearth, and meals simmered slowly. Soups of barley and vegetables, fish stews, flatbreads. Cheese presses and butter churns stood quietly near the fire. These tools, worn but cared for, shaped the rhythm of daily nourishment. Nothing flashy, but always present. Trade also shaped tool-making. Blacksmiths were central to the village, sometimes itinerant, sometimes settled. Their forges glowed like hearts at the edge of the settlement. They sharpened blades, mended broken handles, forged nails and hinges, fashioned new tools. A skilled smith could turn a rough bar of iron into something life-changing. Even in remote valleys, a blacksmith's work echoed in every household. And still, despite the hard labor, these tools were not just practical. They were beautiful in their own way, smoothed by years, darkened by oil and soot, patched and rewrapped but still useful. Handles bore finger marks, blade edges shone, and when a tool finally wore out, it was sometimes buried with its owner or passed on to a younger hand with a quiet word. The Viking world was built with more than muscle. It was built with memory, precision, and reverence for the things that helped one endure. Each tool carried echoes of tasks completed, of seasons weathered, of lessons learned. Their silence was the silence of deep familiarity, a shared language between people and the things they held, day after day, year after year. To truly understand how Vikings lived, one must understand how they ate, not in grand feasts or mead halls alone, but in the quiet, persistent work of sustenance. Food in the Viking world was not guaranteed. It had to be coaxed from the land, hunted in the forest, netted from the sea, and preserved with skill. Eating was not entertainment. It was survival, repetition, and care. The Viking diet was shaped by what could grow, what could be stored, and what could be caught. In coastal areas, fish was a staple. Herring, cod, and flatfish were smoked or salted to last through the winter. Inland, rivers and lakes provided pike, trout, and eels, caught with nets, traps, or spears. Seals and even whales were hunted when possible, their meat rich and oily, and their fat rendered into tallow. Farming families grew barley, rye, oats, and sometimes wheat, depending on the soil. These grains were the foundation of daily meals, ground into flour, baked into flatbreads, or boiled into hearty porridge. Bread was usually coarse, cooked on hot stones or in clay ovens. Porridge could be stretched with wild greens or dried fruit, flavored with honey when available, or simply salted and served warm from the hearth. Vegetables were more limited than today. Cabbage, leeks, onions, turnips, and beans were common, along with wild herbs gathered in spring and summer, nettle, sorrel, and yarrow among them. Garlic grew well in some regions and was prized for both flavor and perceived healing qualities. Carrots were smaller and more bitter than modern ones, often boiled or stewed. Preservation was key. Root vegetables were buried in cellars, hung from rafters, or pickled in sour whey. Meat, when it came, was treasured. Most households kept a few animals, sheep, goats, pigs, and sometimes cows, not just for slaughter, but for milk, wool, and labor. A pig might be fattened for months before it was finally butchered in autumn. The meat would be salted, smoked, or dried. Blood was saved for sausage. Nothing was wasted. Liver, lungs, heart, and even stomach had uses. Bones flavored stews. Fat was rendered and stored. The act of butchering was both grim and grateful. Dairy was a daily gift from livestock. Milk was turned quickly into butter, cheese, or sour curds to avoid spoilage. Butter was churned in wooden barrels, then packed into clay pots. Cheese ranged from soft curds to firmer, smoked varieties. Yogurt-like drinks may have been common, though their exact preparation is now guessed from fragments of description and residue in ancient vessels. For sweetness, honey was gold. Beekeeping existed in some areas, though wild honey was more common, gathered with care from forest hives. With honey, women made mead, a fermented drink that shimmered with warmth and ritual. Berries were also gathered, bilberries, cloudberries, lingonberries, preserved in honey or dried on woven mats in the sun. Apples were small and tart, but could be sliced and stored. Plums and cherries were rarer, but known. Salt was precious, especially far from the coasts. Inland, it might be traded or extracted with laborious boiling of brine. It preserved meat and fish, flavored broth, and had ceremonial uses. Herbs like dill, caraway, and juniper added scent and bite. Vinegar could be made from fermented grain mash or fruit, sharp, sour, and useful. Meals were simple but thoughtful. A typical day might begin with flatbread and curds, a midday bowl of porridge, and a stew at night. Stews changed with the seasons, Fish in spring, game in autumn, beans and barley always. They simmered for hours over slow fires, deepening in flavor, stirred by hand and tasted with care. Some households may have had wooden plates and spoons, others shared bowls and dipped from a common pot. Eating was not done in silence, nor was it loud. It was social, woven into conversation, prayer, and the ticking rhythm of work. Children learned by doing, gathering kindling, washing roots, grinding grain between stone querns. Food was shared, not hoarded. A guest, even a stranger, was offered a bowl and a place by the fire. Hospitality was a virtue, even when supplies ran thin. There were feasts, too, especially after harvests or in winter festivals. These meals featured more meat, special bread, perhaps imported spices or wine if a traveler had brought such luxuries. But even then, the bones of the feast rested on ordinary labor, on salted herring, preserved cabbage, and grain stored months before. Feasts didn't erase the daily reality. They were punctuation in a life of planning and patience. So much of Viking life revolved around food, not just in the eating, but in the making. It tied people to the land and to each other. It was quiet, essential work, repeated through generations. Recipes weren't written, but remembered. Tastes weren't rich, but comforting. And through every season, from planting to slaughter, the act of nourishing oneself remained both humble and profound. To live in the Viking world was to live close to death, not only from violence or battle, as the sagas love to describe, but from illness, accident, childbirth, hunger, or simply the slow wear of age. Life was unpredictable. The world felt full of hidden forces, both helpful and harmful. And when someone died, it was not just an end, it was a crossing. The Vikings did not think of death as silence or oblivion. Rather, they imagined an afterlife that echoed the structure of life, complex, layered, and shaped by deeds. The most famous destination was Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, where warriors chosen by Odin feasted and trained for the final battle of Ragnarok. But Valhalla was not for everyone, nor even for most. Many believed in hell, a realm ruled by a goddess of the same name, cold and shadowed, but not necessarily a place of punishment. Some spoke of Folkvanger, Freda's Field, where fallen warriors might also go. Others imagined that the dead lingered near their farms, walking the land in spirit, offering blessings, or, if angered, misfortune. Ancestors were remembered in stories and in stones, but also in gestures. The setting of a place at the table, the whispering of a name before sleep. Burial customs varied by region, time, and wealth. Some were grand and symbolic. Others were simple and personal. The dead might be buried in ship-shaped graves or in actual boats, covered in earth and stones. A chieftain might be sent off with weapons, tools, and sacrificed animals, or even, in the most dramatic tales, with attendants or wives who chose, or were forced, to follow him in death. But these practices were rare, not every day. More common were quiet burials near the homestead or in designated fields, marked by stones or wooden posts. Bodies were wrapped in cloth or placed in wooden coffins. Offerings accompanied them: a comb, a knife, a necklace, or a small hammer of Thor. These items were not only practical but symbolic, meant to help the deceased in the next life or signal their identity to the unseen world. Graves were places of memory and caution. People might walk around them, not over. Children were warned to behave near them. Some feared the dead might return, not as honored ancestors, but as Draugr, restless corpses who haunted the living. Tales of such beings were part of the oral tradition, passed from hearth to hearth. To prevent such returns, some graves were sealed with extra care. In a few, stones were placed over the chest or tied to the limbs, as if to weigh the body down. There were also rituals for the soul's journey. These might involve a priestess or wise woman, known in some texts as a völva, who performed chants or rites to guide the spirit. Fires might be lit, not just for warmth or mourning, but to signal to the gods. Sometimes the family gathered for 9 nights after the death, feasting and speaking of the one who had gone, anchoring their memory in words. Viking funerals were not uniform. In wealthier coastal areas, cremation remained common, with ashes buried in mounds or scattered. Elsewhere, inhumation, burial of the body, grew more popular, especially as Christianity began to spread. The old ways shifted. Crosses replaced Thor's hammers. Churches began to rise where burial mounds once stood, but the transition was slow, and old beliefs lingered. In many households, Christian prayers mingled with pagan charms, and the line between them blurred. Even within the pagan system, beliefs weren't always fixed. Norse mythology was a living thing, told in poetry, remembered in fragments, reshaped by each generation. Not every Viking believed exactly the same, and most likely didn't speak of the afterlife with certainty. Death was mystery. It was darkness, but not always fear. For many, it was the next step in a story already unfolding. The dead were not just remembered, they were woven into the land itself. A farm might be named for a grandfather. A stone might bear the runes of a lost sister. Children were sometimes named after the recently departed, believed to carry a thread of their spirit forward. In this way, the past never truly disappeared. It softened, but it remained. What we find today, graves unearthed, bones studied, artifacts catalogued, are echoes of those beliefs. A sword buried beside a man, a brooch beside a woman, charcoal from a funeral pyre, fragments of stories, incomplete but resonant. They remind us that the Vikings, so often depicted as raiders or legends, were also mourners and rememberers. They loved, they feared, and they honored their dead. In the silence after a passing, there were still chores to do, fields to tend, animals to feed, children to calm. But somewhere in the back of the mind, the whisper of the departed lingered, maybe in the wind across the fjord or in the flicker of the hearth. Life moved on, but it did not forget. To live as a Viking was to live with one foot in the visible world and another in the unseen. Daily life was grounded in chores and craft, but beneath it, many believed in threads woven through fate, nature, and spirit. The world was not only what one could touch and see, it was alive with signs, omens, and whispers. The Vikings did not have written scripture, but they did have runes. More than an alphabet, runes held symbolic power. Each carried a sound, a name, and a meaning, associated with forces like strength, harvest, or protection. Runes might be carved into wood or bone, etched onto sword hilts, or worn as amulets. They could mark ownership, record a name, or in sacred contexts, cast lots and read fate. Runes were not for casual use. To carve them was to call on what they represented. They were treated with reverence, especially in the hands of a Safgana or Volvulv women who practiced spiritual craft. These seeressses held a unique role in Viking society. Though sometimes feared, they were also sought after in uncertainty. Dressed in dark cloaks, adorned with beads and staffs, they might chant or enter trance-like states, seeking visions from beyond. Spiritual guidance came in many forms, not just from runes. Dreams were taken seriously. A well-timed dream might be seen as a message from a god, a forewarning, or a glimpse of things to come. Elders often interpreted dreams, especially those with animals, storms, or battles. A wolf in a dream might mean danger ahead. A tree blooming out of season could signal birth or renewal. Ravens flying in a certain pattern, the cry of a gull, or the way fog moved over the sea, these were read like messages layered with meaning. Magic in Viking life wasn't like modern fiction. It was subtle, woven into reality. There were charms for childbirth, chants for calming storms, and whispered words for livestock. Iron was thought to ward off spirits. Salt and fire were cleansing. Water from certain springs was said to heal. These beliefs didn't need temples. They lived at the hearth, by the shore, in the woods. Often, people remembered little verses their grandmothers had whispered, passed down from one quiet healer to the next. Vikings often wore protective symbols. Thor's hammer was the most common, small enough to hang from a necklace, yet heavy with meaning. It offered strength and safety, especially against chaos. Some wore amber to calm the soul, or a knot of thread tied in a certain way to bind harm. Children were guarded with care. A mother might tuck a piece of iron under bedding, or mark a symbol near the cradle to deter Hulju folk, the hidden folk. Belief in spirits was widespread. These weren't always grand gods like Odin or Freyja, but smaller presences, land spirits, ancestors, and unseen creatures that coexisted with human life. A boulder might be left untouched, not out of laziness, but because it was thought to house a spirit. Some trees were never cut. Offerings of milk, beer, or food might be left quietly, just in case. It wasn't fear so much as respect. Weather itself was seen as a kind of speech. A sudden wind might mean change. A still, heavy sky before sailing might prompt delay, not only from caution but instinct. Vikings didn't have meteorology, but they watched the skies with practiced eyes and read meaning in their silence. While gods were important, they weren't omnipresent. More often, people turned to local traditions. A wise old woman in the village might hold as much authority in spiritual matters as the stories told of Odin or Loki. Religion, as we see it today, didn't dominate Viking life. Belief was personal, shaped by region, family, and experience. Festivals marked the turning of seasons. Blots, sacrificial feasts, honored gods or spirits. These might involve animals, shared meals, or ritual drinking. They weren't solemn but filled with music, laughter, and storytelling. Community and spirituality were not separate. Worship lived in gathering, eating, remembering. As Christianity spread, old practices adapted. Runes were still carved, though sometimes disguised. Ancient festivals were renamed but kept. Spirits of the land became saints in new stories. The Vikings weren't quick to abandon the old ways. For generations, both faiths lived side by side, often in quiet coexistence. Even today, the echo remains. In Iceland, stories of elves and hidden people are still told. Runes are studied not only as language, but as mystery. And many who study the Viking past are drawn not only to ships and axes, but to the whispers in the wind and belief flickering in the long, quiet dark. Behind the clang of metal, the songs of sea voyagers, and the myths of fearless warriors, there was another Viking story, one seldom told. It was the story of weariness, of longing, of the private interior carried silently by those who lived hard lives. For every blade sharpened and boat launched, there was someone watching the weather, worrying over grain, or wondering whether the gods were listening. Viking life demanded endurance, not just strength. Each season brought its trials. Winters were long, and though fires burned in the hearth, they didn't always banish the cold. Families huddled together in darkened rooms, listening to winds scratch timber walls. Food stores had to last. Illness crept in, coughs that lingered, fevers that stayed. Spring was never guaranteed. Only hope, habit, and preparation. Even in warmth, life carried weight. A man might till soil day after day, seeing the same rocks unearthed each year, hoping for a harvest strong enough to trade or feed his kin. A woman might carry water from the stream with a child on her back, her feet sore, her mind tracing memories of those she'd lost. Life asked much and left little time for reflection. Still, reflection came, often at night. When the house fell quiet and smoke curled upward, people would sit in silence, not always praying, Sometimes just remembering, the face of a brother lost at sea, the voice of a mother buried under stone, the way a child laughed in sleep. These moments were soft and inward, and they stitched people together more than battle ever could. Children grew up quickly. They learned to read the sky, mend nets, hold silence when elders spoke. But they also played, ran, whispered stories in the hayloft. They were taught to be strong, but not invulnerable. They could grieve, could be afraid. A father might carve a toy after a storm. A grandmother might hum an old lullaby, worn soft by time. In slow summer afternoons, when chores paused and nothing moved but shadows across the grass, people told quiet stories. Not sagas of kings or monsters, but simple remembrances. How a stew was made, how someone once danced under moonlight. These oral tapestries stitched memory and longing. They made the past present. They gave the dead a place at the table. Vikings turned inward during hardship, not from stoicism, but necessity. Grief was expressed in ritual, laying stones, lighting fires, whispering names into the wind. Loss was not something to fix, it was something to carry, woven into the soul like threads in wool. Friendship mattered. Trust wasn't taken lightly. In tight-knit communities, a good neighbor could mean survival. Men and women worked side by side, shared tasks, building fences, tending animals, preparing fish. Created bonds. A nod, a helping hand, a loaf of bread. These were offerings of connection. There were bad days, days when tempers frayed, when boats failed, when children cried from hunger. But there was also forgiveness, a shared mead after a quarrel, a gesture of peace carved in wood or told at the hearth. Community wasn't perfect. It was practiced, renewed daily with effort. Spirituality soothed what couldn't be controlled. Runes might be traced not for glory, but for rest, peace, a safe birth. Gods were called on in weariness, when wind wouldn't shift, when crops failed, when sleep refused to come. In those moments, belief became lifeline. Some turned to sacred groves or standing stones, places where the veil between worlds thinned. Offerings of milk or honey were poured into earth. Whispered words, half prayer, half memory, were sent into leaves. Others clutched small carvings, a smooth stone, a woven knot. These gave comfort where reason could not. The sagas speak of fury and feats, but they leave out the silences, the hours weaving, mending, boiling broth, waiting for someone to return. In these stretches of ordinary time, the true strength of Viking life lived in patience, in choosing to stay. And there were dreams, hopes for a better harvest, calmer seas, children who lived longer than their parents. Some dreams were small, a warm bed, a shared song, the return of a traveling friend. These weren't naive. They came from hardship, and still people hoped. So much of Viking life was invisible, etched not in stone, but gesture, in how someone wrapped a blanket around a child, in hands meeting over bread, in the silence after a storm when nothing was said, but everything was understood. This was the heart of Viking endurance, not bold conquest, but quiet resilience, the ability to keep going, to mend what was torn, to hold grief and joy in the same hand, and to live fully in the spaces between storm and song. Death in Viking life was not an ending to be hidden, but a presence woven into daily thought. It came with the seasons, in childbirth and old age in battle, and sometimes quietly after a long illness or a slip on ice or a winter too harsh for even the strong. People lived beside the reality of dying, not in fear but in familiarity. When someone passed, the village did not rush. There was a calm to it, a practiced reverence. The body was washed with care. A loved one might comb the hair one last time, or place tokens in the hand, a ring, a coin, a carved piece of wood. These were gestures of both farewell and protection, offerings for the journey ahead. Some were buried in earth, others placed in boats that became graves. The manner of burial varied with status, region, and family custom, but at its core, death was an act of remembrance. A might rise over the grave. A simple wooden post could mark the spot. The body was not just interred, it was returned to the land, to the sea, to the gods. Mourning was not loud, but steady. Grief did not erupt in spectacle. It showed itself in worn expressions, in the long silence over evening meals, in the way someone would reach for a hand that was no longer there. A brother might carve a symbol into a beam of the longhouse. A wife might hum the song her husband once sang while fixing nets. Grief became ritual through repetition. Stories helped carry the weight. The one who died was not erased, but folded gently into memory. Around the fire, someone might tell a tale of how the departed once outran a storm, or traded silver for a flute no one could play. Memory was shaped into myth, not in grandeur, but in warmth. To remember was to honor and to keep alive. Some deaths came suddenly, and others came with long farewells. Both left space behind. The Vikings did not try to fill that space too quickly. A bed was left untouched. A seat at the hearth remained vacant for a time. The absence was noticed, acknowledged, respected. This too was part of the grief. Spirits, many believed, lingered. Not in fearsome ways, but as echoes of presence. A creak in the rafters, a breeze through the trees, a dream that felt more than a dream. It was not uncommon for someone to whisper to the air or pour a drink into the soil as if sharing one last toast. The line between the living and the dead was not always clear, and that was accepted. There were beliefs in the afterlife, yes, but they were not always as simple as the sagas suggest. Valhalla was one possibility, but it was not the only one. There were fields of rest, halls for quiet souls, and journeys that had no words. The dead, it was thought, found their own place, just as the living must find theirs. No one pretended to know exactly where the dead went. What mattered more was how they were remembered here. Death shaped the village in subtle ways. A child born after the passing of a grandfather might bear their name. A tool left behind, a hammer, a knife was used with added care, as if the hand of the departed still guided its weight. Songs were altered to include names. Runes were carved into doorposts for protection or to preserve a legacy. There were customs around anniversaries. A year after death, families might gather to speak the name aloud once more, to light a fire, to offer food to the earth or sea. These rituals varied across time and region, but the theme was always connection. The dead were gone, but not gone entirely. They remained in the stories, in the land, and in the hearts of those left behind. And while some deaths brought sorrow, others brought peace. An elder who had lived many winters, who had seen the births of grandchildren and the harvests of many years, might pass with a kind of grace. Their departure was a closing of a long chapter, mourned but also honored. Not all grief was sharp. Some was gentle, like the fading of a long summer. Children learned early that death was part of life. They were not shielded from it. They might attend the burial, help with the rituals, or place flowers on the grave. They were taught to speak of the dead with kindness, to ask questions, to remember. In doing so, they grew with a sense of continuity, not just of time, but of belonging to something larger than themselves. Viking death was never merely about endings. It was a transition, deeply personal and communally held. It invited reflection on the person, on the past, on the fragile and fleeting beauty of being alive. The living carried on, yes, but always with traces of those who had gone before. And in quiet moments, under star-filled skies or beside a smoldering hearth, someone would close their eyes and recall a voice, a laugh, a touch. In that remembering, something stirred, a comfort, a presence, a sense that nothing truly vanished. It merely changed form, like mist rising from the sea. From the sea. As night falls over the quiet village, the long day gives way to hush. The forge has gone cold, the boats are moored, and the footsteps of daily life soften into silence. A final candle flickers against the wood of the longhouse walls. Outside, the stars emerge, clear, still, and ancient. This was the rhythm they knew. Work and rest, effort and stillness, morning song and evening hush. The Vikings were not always at war, not always crossing seas or clashing swords. More often they were simply living, gathering wood, turning soil, mending ropes, stirring broth. And when their hands stilled, when the tools were hung and the sky grew dark, there was time to sit, time to listen to the wind in the trees, to the creak of beams above, to the breathing of animals resting nearby. Life slowed then. Stories were told in low voices. Wool was spun by firelight. The longhouse itself was a world of warmth. Families slept together beneath the same sloped roof. Children near the hearth, elders near the walls. Dogs curled by the door. A carved staff rested beside the bed. Dreams came wrapped in the scent of wood smoke and wool in the comfort of being close. Rest was not just the absence of toil, it was valued, even ritualized. The Vikings understood that the body, pushed by labor and weather, needed renewal. So too did the spirit. Sleep was not wasted. It was healing. It was a return to the self. They believed dreams could carry meaning. A vision in sleep might be a message from beyond, or a memory drawn deeper. Some woke with a name on their lips and did not know why. Others felt guided by something unseen. Sleep was not feared. It was a place they entered with trust. Sometimes, before sleep, someone would whisper a prayer to the old gods, an offering to Thor for strength, or to Frigg for peace in the home. Some placed a carved amulet near the bedpost or knotted thread around the wrist for protection. These were quiet gestures, familiar and enduring. The night was not something to banish, but to dwell within. In darkness there was reflection. In stillness a kind of truth. The crackle of the hearth, the scent of peat smoke, the distant bark of a dog, all were part of the soundscape that wrapped the house in calm. And so, in this final hour, we see Viking life not in the clash of blades, but in the closing of doors, the dimming of flames, the hush of snow falling on thatch. We see it in family closeness, in steady breath, in the slow passage of time. Their world was not loud. It was textured, full of scent and rhythm and care. The feel of carved wood beneath fingers, the warmth of bread after work, the murmur of a river passing stones that no longer needed names. Even the most honored, the smith, the farmer, the shipwright, eventually laid down their tools and let the quiet come. It was not surrender, but return. A return to the steady pulse of the earth, to the rhythm of breath and body, to the softness beneath the day. The seasons shaped this peace. Winter nights were long, but not lonely. Families gathered close. Tales were told of distant kin, of omens and spirits, of creatures said to roam the frost. There was time to mend, to speak of dreams. Even the wind at the door reminded them they were safe within. And in spring, as days lengthened and snow gave way to green, life stirred again, but slowly. The world turned but never rushed. That was the Viking way, a pace tuned to wind and water, to grain and fire, to what could not be forced. They followed that rhythm season by season, night by night. Perhaps that is what remains when all else fades. Not raids or silver, but memory of care. A child's hand in a parent's, a bowl passed by firelight, a song that lingers in the bones. As we leave this world, this village of woven lives, of seasons and stories, of axes and ale, we do so gently. The fire has dimmed but not gone out. The night wraps the longhouse in silence, and in that silence something deep endures. Not spectacle, but the quiet dignity of being alive together. And now the world turns dark. The stars look down, ancient and unmoving, as they once did on Viking fields and fjords. Somewhere, a ship rests at anchor, a home stands warm. A story ends not with finality, but with rest. So close your eyes. Let the wind pass over thatched roofs. Let the hush settle in your chest. You are far from battle, far from the myths. You are here, in the rhythm of quiet lives, where even the strong must sleep. And in that sleep, perhaps, you will dream of longhouses and lanterns, of hearths and heather, of lives well lived in the soft spaces between storm and song.